Chapter 1. The Ledger in the Basement. Long before anyone alive today took their first breath, a sealed ledger lay forgotten in the cool, dim basement of the Adams County Courthouse in Natchez, Mississippi. It was placed there quietly in the summer of 1846, tucked away as though someone hoped time itself would swallow it. For more than a century, it remained untouched, its pages sleeping beneath layers of dust, until a renovation crew stumbled upon the locked volume in 1958. When they pried it open, expecting old tax documents or land records, they instead found 73 pages detailing a young woman's unraveling, recorded day after day, from June to early November of that long-gone year. Each entry was written in the same precise, almost clinical script. The ledger tracked Margaret Halloway's weight, her daily labor, her so-called infractions, and the punishments imposed upon her. Most pages were crowded with stern notes and measurements, but the final line, dated November 9th, held only 4 chilling words. The treatment is concluded. Margaret had been 23 that summer. She was the only daughter of Edmund Halloway, a man whose wealth stretched across thousands of acres of fertile Mississippi land. To the outside world, Margaret was spoken of as difficult, willful, and troubled. To those who truly knew her, she was simply a young woman caught between her father's rigid expectations and the small sparks of independence she tried to claim for herself. The day before the ledger's entries began, Edmund had assembled his household staff and several enslaved workers and announced that Margaret required a specialized treatment. Behind the grand plantation house, he had converted a large barn into what he described as a therapeutic facility. 3 enslaved men were chosen to carry out the regimen, men who had no say in the matter, no power to refuse, and no way to escape the responsibility placed upon them. Edmund assured his neighbors he had consulted physicians in New Orleans. They, he claimed, recommended rigorous manual labor to address Margaret's hysteria, her moral instability, and her supposed decline into gluttony and disobedience. But the truth that unfolded within that barn was something far darker than treatment. The ledger, along with later evidence, revealed months of relentless psychological pressure, an orchestrated breaking of Margaret's spirit, and the men ordered to enforce this routine lived each day under unbearable strain. They were expected to drive the plantation owner's daughter as if she were a field hand, punishing even the smallest deviation, yet they had to watch her deteriorate under the cruelty they were forced to administer. Every day, they had to choose between obedience and their own humanity. The full story might have faded permanently into silence had 3 unexpected discoveries not surfaced. First, the ledger itself contradicted Edmund's polished public narrative about his daughter's improvement. Then, during a historical survey in 2003, archaeologists uncovered the charred remains of the converted barn. The burn patterns, the foundation layout, and the items recovered there revealed disturbing inconsistencies with the official account of its destruction. And finally, in 2007, descendants of one of the enslaved men came forward with preserved family testimony. Those handwritten notes, passed secretly down through generations, recorded what their ancestor had seen and endured during those 5 months. His account filled in the silences the ledger left behind. The picture that emerged was grim, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Margaret's story, long buried in darkness, began to stir again. Faint at first, like a whisper beneath the floorboards, and then unmistakable. The ledger did not simply recount a young woman's suffering. It revealed why so many involved either vanished, remained silent, or passed their knowledge down in hushed fragments to those they trusted. It exposed the chasm between Edmund Halloway's public persona and the private choices he made when confronted with a daughter who challenged his authority. To understand how such a situation came to be, one must return to Riverbend Plantation in the spring of 1846, when Edmund stood at the peak of his influence. He was 51 then, a man shaped by decades of prosperity. He had inherited Riverbend from his father more than 20 years earlier, and in that time, he expanded it into a 2,000-acre estate stretching along the Mississippi River about 12 miles north of Natchez. The plantation was known for its cotton crops, though tobacco fields and vast vegetable gardens spread across its landscape as well. Altogether, he held ownership over 137 enslaved people, an immense fortune by any measure. Yet what set Edmund apart was not only his wealth, but his reputation. In parish records, local newspapers, and personal letters of the time, he was praised as a devout Christian gentleman. He occupied a prominent pew at First Presbyterian Church every Sunday and led Bible classes with unwavering regularity. He donated to missions, funded improvements to the orphanage, and personally financed much of the construction of a new schoolhouse in Natchez. In moments of hardship within the community, he was often the one neighbors approached for loans, for support, or for reassurance. To those who lived beyond the walls of his plantation, Edmund appeared as the model of moral respectability. He had married Sarah Chandler in 1824, a woman from a respected Charleston family. Her dowry had strengthened the plantation's finances, and together they were seen as a graceful and charitable couple. Outwardly, their life seemed ordered and steady, a household governed by piety and decorum. But within the private world of Riverbend Plantation, the patterns were more complicated, the expectations more rigid, and the consequences for disobedience far more severe. Margaret, their only daughter, had inherited a spark of independence that her father did not know how to manage. She had rejected 4 marriage proposals, an act Edmund interpreted not as personal preference but as rebellion. She sometimes answered him sharply. She was rumored to hold affection for a man Edmund considered beneath her station. To him, these were not youthful traits. They were symptoms of decay. And so, after consulting physicians whose methods reflected the harsh attitudes of the era, Edmund constructed a plan he believed would restore his daughter to what he deemed proper behavior. The barn, the ledger, the orders he issued, these were all part of a carefully arranged system meant to reshape her. But instead of curing anything, it trapped Margaret in a nightmare from which she could not escape. This is the beginning of the story that lay hidden beneath courthouse dust. The story that survived only through a ledger, a burned foundation, and the courage of descendants who refused to let the truth die. And now, as you drift gently deeper into this tale, we step quietly onto the grounds of Riverbend Plantation, into the humid air of an 1846 Mississippi spring, when the world still believed Edmund Halloway to be the most righteous man in Adams County, long before anyone knew what was unfolding behind the locked doors of that barn. Chapter 2. Edmund's World and Margaret's Upbringing. Edmund Livingston had always imagined himself the quiet architect of an orderly world, a man whose plantation, household, and family all moved according to a rhythm he alone conducted. His wife, Sarah, had once been the gentle center of that imagined harmony. Soft-spoken and devout, she drifted through their home like a steady prayer, tending to every domestic task with a devotion that seemed almost monastic. Margaret arrived in 1823, just before Edmund and Sarah were formally married, a detail never acknowledged aloud, and quickly buried beneath the polite silence of Southern society. 3 years later came a son, little Edmund Jr., whose brief life flickered out before he could walk. Fever took him swiftly, but its shadow lingered for years, settling most heavily on Sarah. Her grief hollowed her, drawing her into long hours alone with scripture and missionary letters, as if she sought refuge in a world far from the one that had wounded her. By the time she passed away in 1839, when Margaret was 16, it was widely understood, though never said, that sorrow had weakened Sarah more than any illness. Officially, fever carried her off. But those who had watched her fade believed she had lost the will to remain tethered to life after her son's death. Edmund mourned as society expected. He wore black, delivered a tender eulogy, and commissioned an elegant marble monument that stood in Spartan contrast to the cotton fields beyond it. No one questioned his sincerity or his reputation as a dutiful husband. When the rituals of grief finally receded, only Margaret remained, his surviving child, his presumed heir, and painfully, the daughter who confounded him at every turn. She had never been the compliant, decorative girl he expected. Even as a child, Margaret was full of questions, curious, restless, unwilling to accept "because I said so" as an answer. And though Edmund had once encouraged education to refine her into a desirable match, he had not anticipated how knowledge might sharpen her independent mind. French, history, literature, music. All these studies had been intended as adornments. Instead, they shaped her into a young woman who thought deeply, spoke boldly, and absorbed ideas he considered dangerous. After Sarah's death, Margaret's transformation accelerated. Grief manifested in her body before it did in her emotions. She had always been sturdily built, but within a few years she grew markedly heavier. By the mid-1840s, she weighed more than 200 pounds, an unthinkable size to the society that judged a woman's worth by delicacy and restraint. To Edmund, her appearance was not merely a disappointment. It was a threat to every plan he had laid for her future. Who would marry a woman who refused to fit the mold, literally and figuratively? But the truth, though Edmund never admitted it, was that her body troubled him far less than her mind. Margaret read authors she should not have known existed. Wollstonecraft's radical arguments for women's rights found fertile ground in her thoughts. Abolitionist newspapers, smuggled into Mississippi despite bans, circulated through her hands, leaving behind smoldering questions she could not easily ignore. The first true rupture came in 1843. Edmund hosted a grand dinner for wealthy planters and their refined wives, expecting the evening to unfold with predictable politeness. But as the conversation shifted toward the expansion of slavery, one guest confidently proclaimed that the institution was a blessing to the enslaved, sanctioned by scripture and civilization. Margaret expected to sit quietly, like a painted portrait, instead stepped forward with a calm, unsettling truth. She questioned how anyone could believe that those torn from their families and forced into labor are better off. She wondered aloud whether slavery warped not only the lives of the enslaved, but the souls of the enslavers. The room fell utterly still, no argument, no polite deflection, just stunned silence. A woman had crossed a line that polite society did not forgive. Edmund abruptly ended the evening, citing Margaret's delicate nerves. When the final carriage rolled away, he confronted her in his study, the room thick with the scent of oak and disappointment. She apologized, but Edmund could see the truth in her eyes. She regretted causing embarrassment, not speaking her beliefs. In the months that followed, the tension between father and daughter deepened. Margaret was found speaking with enslaved workers, not issuing orders but asking about their homes, their children, the loved ones ripped from them by sale. She slipped food to the hungry and even taught a young girl the alphabet, an act forbidden by Mississippi law and, in Edmund's eyes, a direct challenge to his authority. Desperate, Edmund attempted to rein her in. Books were restricted to approved religious volumes. Her interactions were monitored. Invitations were arranged with eligible young men in hopes she might soon become another household's responsibility. Yet nothing he did dimmed her resolve. Margaret remained, in every way that mattered, her mother's daughter, tender-hearted, questioning, quietly rebellious. But she was also something Sarah had never been: fearless. And in Edmund's rigid world, there was no place for a woman unafraid to think for herself. The house, once meant to be a sanctuary, now felt like the tight walls of a story waiting to break open. And Margaret, caught between expectation and conviction, continued to grow, not only in defiance but in the depth of her heart and the strength of her awakening conscience. Chapter 3. Margaret's Defiance and Edmund's Fear. Margaret Livingston had reached the age when society expected young women to be drifting toward marriage like leaves carried by a gentle river. Yet she remained rooted firmly in place, unmoved by the 4 suitors who had, over the course of 2 years, tried to court her. Each man arrived with hopeful intentions and left bewildered and rejected. Margaret dismissed them for reasons that seemed trivial on the surface. One lacked imagination, another mistreated his servants, a third chewed too loudly, and the 4th spoke to her as though she were a child. But beneath these explanations, Edmund sensed a deeper truth. His daughter simply had no desire to marry at all. The idea unsettled him. He tried, gently at first, to reason with her. He reminded her that an unmarried woman was an object of speculation and pity, that without a husband, she would float uselessly at the edges of society, dependent and vulnerable. Margaret listened with a patient, almost amused expression, as though observing a creature trapped in outdated logic. When she finally answered, she did so with a calm certainty that struck Edmund like a blow. She told him she would sooner live alone all her days than tie herself to a man she neither respected nor cared for. She insisted she was perfectly capable of managing her own finances, her own choices, her own life. And if society found that shocking, well, perhaps society was the thing in need of reform. By 1846, Edmund felt as though the ground beneath his carefully ordered existence had begun to crack. Margaret, now 23, had grown more self-assured, more outspoken, and more unwilling to bend. Her weight had increased as well, drawing whispers from neighbors who already questioned her unconventional opinions. They murmured that Edmund had lost control of his household, that perhaps his own character was reflected in Margaret's rebellion. Edmund had spent years cultivating the image of a principled Christian patriarch, steady, respectable, a man whose home was a model of discipline. The idea that his daughter might tarnish that was intolerable. In his eyes, Margaret had become something dangerous, a woman who believed she had the right to shape her own destiny. And in Edmund's world, such an idea was not simply incorrect. It was a threat. Something had to be done. She had to be corrected, reshaped, and molded back into the vision he had always held for her. That spring, Edmund announced that he would travel to New Orleans for business. He spoke of meetings with cotton brokers and bankers, which was not entirely untrue. But beneath those respectable errands lay a darker purpose. In the back rooms of taverns and offices along the Mississippi River, he sought out men who dealt in quiet forms of coercion, men known for breaking the spirits of enslaved workers who resisted plantation rule. They were not doctors, though they sometimes adopted the language of medicine. They were specialists in obedience, experts in dismantling willpower without leaving marks that other men would question. Edmund described Margaret's behavior in clinical, dispassionate terms, presenting her refusal to marry and her outspoken nature as symptoms of a disorder. What he desired, he explained, was a method of correction disguised as care, discipline that he could publicly describe as treatment. The men offered him a plan crafted from years of experience in subduing those who dared to challenge authority. Fatigue, they said, fogged the mind. Isolation frayed emotional strength. A mix of harshness and unpredictability ensured confusion. Humiliation eroded pride. And for the process to be effective, it must be consistent, recorded, and relentless, chipping away at the person's resolve until obedience became second nature. Edmund returned to Riverbend Plantation with a quiet, fixed determination that unsettled even the most loyal members of his household. Over several secretive days, he prepared a place that would serve as the center of Margaret's transformation. The old equipment barn behind the main house, a long, solid building with thick wooden walls, was cleared of its usual tools and machinery. Locks were installed on every door. Hooks were embedded into beams that once held only lanterns and harvest sacks. A heavy grain mill, requiring constant physical force to turn, was positioned like a silent sentinel in the center of the floor. In one corner, Edmund placed a thin mattress on bare planks, a harsh contrast to the soft feather bed Margaret had slept in her entire life. In another, he arranged a small desk, a straight-backed chair, and the leather-bound ledger where he intended to record each detail of her progress. But he knew the process could not be carried out alone. He carefully chose 3 enslaved men from the plantation, men who were disciplined, obedient, and unlikely to question orders. Men who understood how to follow instruction without adding cruelty or compassion that might undermine Edmund's intentions. The first he selected was Benjamin, a quiet, steady field hand in his late 30s who had lived on the plantation for half his life. Benjamin was known for his composure and reliability, traits Edmund believed essential for what lay ahead. Every piece of this plan was arranged with the same precision Edmund applied to his crops and finances. Every detail was chosen with one purpose: to render his daughter compliant, moldable, ready to accept whatever future he chose for her. He convinced himself this was an act of necessity, of stewardship, even of love twisted into a shape he could recognize. And as the preparations neared completion, he felt a grim certainty settle over him. Margaret's world was about to change irrevocably, and though she could not yet sense the storm gathering around her, the first gusts were already stirring the still air of Riverbend Plantation. Chapter 4. Planning the barn treatment. The 3 men Edmund had chosen to carry out his plan were not selected by accident. Each had been chosen for reasons that served Edmund's purpose and exploited their deepest vulnerabilities. Benjamin, the eldest among them, lived with his wife Ruth and their 3 children in a small cabin near the riverbank. He had spent 15 years on Riverbend Plantation and understood all too well how quickly safety could become precarious. Edmund never doubted Benjamin's obedience because he understood exactly what was at stake. Any threat to his family would bend him, force him, reshape him more effectively than chains ever could. Samuel, 27 and quiet to the point of invisibility, had been born on the plantation. His world began and ended with Riverbend's boundaries. He worked in the stables, tending horses with a contemplative precision that made him seem older than his years. People rarely noticed him, and Edmund counted on that. Samuel had no history of rebellion, no family elsewhere, no means of escape. He was, in Edmund's mind, the perfect instrument. Silent, compliant, predictable. Daniel, at 33, was the most complicated of the three. A carpenter by trade, he repaired everything from window frames to wagon axles, and carried within him a skill many enslaved people were forbidden to possess: literacy. A former owner had taught him the basics of reading and writing before debt forced a sale in 1838 that brought him to Riverbend. Edmund understood the double-edged nature of Daniel's knowledge. Literacy made him a potential threat, someone capable of grasping the full meaning of what Edmund intended. But it also made him valuable. If the ledger required additional documentation, Daniel could assist. If precise instructions needed copying or careful tracking, Daniel's hands could manage it. On June 13th, Edmund summoned the three men into his study. The shutters were drawn, muting the morning light into a cold gray that made Edmund's expression seem even harder. He outlined what he called his daughter's treatment, a term he used with deliberate calm, as though he were explaining a medical procedure rather than a calculated plan of psychological domination. He told them Margaret required discipline, structure, and rigorous labor to correct behaviors he considered dangerous. They would supervise every part of her day. They would monitor her work, note her resistance, judge her compliance, and record everything without emotion or sympathy. Their orders were simple. Margaret was to be treated not as the plantation owner's daughter, but as an untrained field worker expected to obey without hesitation. Edmund's tone left no room for questions. Yet Benjamin, compelled by fear and desperation, asked quietly, what would happen if they refused? Edmund's answer was delivered with chilling ease. If Benjamin defied him, Ruth and the children would be sold to different plantations across the deep South, scattered like seeds on the wind, never to be reunited. There was no anger in Edmund's voice, only certainty, which made the threat even more terrifying. Benjamin understood instantly. Samuel and Daniel were given similar ultimatums tied to the people they cared about, and like Benjamin, they realized there was no real choice at all. That night, Benjamin sat with Ruth on the edge of their bed, explaining through halting breaths what Edmund had ordered. Ruth's face crumpled with horror. She clutched Benjamin's hand and begged him to refuse, to run, to escape before becoming part of something monstrous. But Benjamin knew the futility of running. They would be found. They always were. And his children, bright-eyed, curious, innocent, would pay the price. Staying was its own kind of torment, but leaving would destroy the people he loved. Ruth, reluctantly, painfully, understood. Samuel had a similar conversation with his brother, and Daniel spoke quietly with a friend he trusted. Each man wrestled with the same impossible question. How do you protect the people you love when every path leads toward suffering? Their choices were not choices at all, only different shades of heartbreak. At dawn, on June 14th, the air heavy with the warmth of approaching summer, Edmund escorted Margaret to the barn. He had given her no warning, offering only a curt instruction to dress plainly and follow him. As they walked, the gravel whispered beneath their feet, a soft, steady sound that did nothing to hint at the upheaval awaiting her. When Edmund unlatched the barn door, Margaret stepped into a space that no longer resembled a storage building. The grain mill dominated the center of the room like an enormous wooden creature waiting to be pushed into motion. The thin mattress in the corner, the bare floor, the locked doors, each detail revealed what Edmund had planned, though she could not yet grasp the full extent of it. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel stood silently, their faces carved with dread. Margaret's confusion hardened into disbelief. "What is this?" she demanded. Edmund answered with chilling calm. This, he explained, was her treatment. She had shown herself incapable of proper conduct, unwilling to accept the guidance expected of a respectable woman. She had embarrassed him publicly, challenged him privately, and refused every opportunity to redeem herself. Now, he said, she would live in the barn under supervision until her will was corrected. Margaret stared at him as though seeing a stranger. Her voice trembled with anger. "You can't do this. You cannot imprison your own daughter." Edmund's expression barely shifted. He told her that as her father, he not only had the right but the duty to correct her in whatever manner he deemed necessary. And with those words, Margaret understood, too late, that the walls of the barn were not the only enclosure being built around her. A prison of control, of fear, of twisted paternal certainty had already closed in, and there would be no easy escape from it. Chapter 5, Day 1. Margaret enters the barn. The heavy barn door groaned as it shut behind Margaret, and for a moment the dim interior seemed to swallow her whole. Dust drifted lazily in the beams of afternoon light, as if the world inside this wooden shell existed on its own slow, breathless timeline. Her father stood facing her, rigid with certainty, his voice calm in a way that felt far more dangerous than anger. He told her the law was on his side, that as an unmarried woman living under his roof, dependent on his protection, she would obey him or face consequences she could not imagine. He gestured to the three men standing nearby, Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel, each of them tense, eyes lowered, as though shame itself weighed upon their shoulders. They had been appointed her overseers, he declared, and she would answer to them as respectfully as she once answered to him. Margaret stared at the men, searching for the slightest hint of rebellion, of disagreement, of rescue. None came. They remained unmoving, as if carved from the same dull wood that framed the barn. When she turned back to her father and told him he had lost his mind, Edmund only nodded with unsettling patience, as if her defiance merely confirmed his belief in the necessity of what he was doing. "In time," he murmured, "you will understand that everything I ask of you is for your own good." Then, with a final command to begin her treatment, he stepped outside, slid the bolt into place, and left her in the dim, breathless quiet. For several seconds, not a soul stirred. Margaret's body hummed with adrenaline, her pulse loud in her ears, every instinct urging her to run, even though there was nowhere to run to. Benjamin finally cleared his throat, his voice barely more than a whisper as he addressed her. He explained in pained and halting words that they did not wish to enforce her father's will, but their own families would pay the price if they refused. They needed her to cooperate, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. The weight of this realization settled over Margaret like a cold cloth. Her outrage softened into dread as she understood that her father's intentions were not a momentary outburst. They were a design, a plan he meant to carry through. She was to be confined here, worked like a laborer, stripped of choice. The horror of it weakened her knees. "What do you want me to do?" she managed. Daniel pointed to the grain mill, a hulking wooden contraption with a long arm extending outward like a limb waiting to be pushed. They needed corn ground, he told her. 4 hours at the mill, then a short rest, then several hours helping Samuel haul water from the well to the stables, then another stretch at the mill. Afterward, a simple meal. Sleep. Then the routine would begin again. Margaret stared at the mill, the task sounding both absurd and impossible. She tried to imagine herself pushing that heavy beam in endless circles. She had never worked such a device. She had never had reason to. But the locked door behind her spoke its truth clearly. Refusal wasn't an option. So she approached the mill, placed her hands on the rough wood, and pushed. The arm resisted her instantly. Its weight felt far greater than it appeared, and she quickly discovered that each step required deliberate strength. Within minutes, her muscles burned. Within half an hour, her breath came in ragged puffs. Sweat dampened her neck. Her hair clung to her cheeks. Yet she kept pushing, circling the mill again and again, because stopping meant nothing would protect her. If she kept moving, maybe she could outrun the panic threatening to close in on her. The three men watched from a distance. They were meant to supervise, to record her performance in the ledger Edmund had provided, but the act of standing there, silent witnesses to the humiliation of the woman who had grown up in the big house while they labored, brought them a deep, choking discomfort. This inversion of roles disturbed all of them, stirring feelings none of them felt safe to express. When Edmund returned at midday, Margaret was almost delirious with exhaustion. He carried a tin plate holding cornbread and beans, no different from what the enslaved workers received, and observed her with the detached curiosity of a man studying a mechanism rather than a daughter. He noted her trembling limbs, her flushed face, the slackness of her breath. Then he opened his ledger and wrote, June 14th, noon. Initial shock observed, physical weakness developing, compliance ensured by absence of alternatives. He set the food beside her, turned, and left again, not offering a single word of comfort or acknowledgement. The bolt slid into place behind him, with a finality that made her chest ache. And so the first day unfolded, not with a dramatic rebellion or a daring escape, but with quiet, relentless labor. She ground corn. She hauled water until her shoulders throbbed. She ate sparingly. She slept on the thin, straw-filled mattress in the corner. Edmund came and went, weighing her each week, studying her with a clinical distance that chilled her more than anger ever could. Over the following days, time blurred into an endless cycle of waking before dawn, working until her limbs shook, eating enough to stay alive, then collapsing into dreamless sleep. Her body changed quickly under the strain, weight dropping from her frame, her hands roughening with new calluses, her thoughts growing foggy from hunger and fatigue. The fierce burning anger that had sparked inside her on the first day dimmed into something quieter, a dull ache of disbelief, a numbness born from sheer survival. As weeks passed, more than 20 pounds melted from her body. Her clothing hung differently. Her posture sagged from exhaustion. She began moving through each day with the mechanical rhythm of someone whose world had shrunk to a single task: push, lift, carry, breathe. And through it all, the barn became its own strange universe. A place where the daughter of the house labored like the people her father claimed to protect. A place where the lines between power and vulnerability blurred in ways none of them knew how to speak about. A place where Margaret, once sure of her world, now hung suspended between despair and the faint, desperate hope that someone, somehow, would intervene before she disappeared entirely into this life her father had crafted for her. Chapter 6. Breakdown through routine. In the long, suffocating weeks that followed Margaret's first day in the barn, a strange quiet took hold of the place. A quiet filled not with peace but with resignation, like the stillness that settles before a heavy storm. For Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel, that silence was the hardest part. Each of them woke every morning, knowing they were expected to take part in something that twisted their stomachs with shame. They had been backed into a corner, forced to obey orders that felt like poison in the mouth. And yet, powerless to refuse, they searched constantly for tiny, nearly invisible ways to soften Margaret's suffering. Acts so small they might never be noticed, but which felt like the only pieces of themselves they still controlled. Benjamin sometimes let her lean against the wall a few minutes longer than the strict routine allowed, pretending to be adjusting tools or checking the ledger. Samuel, on scorching afternoons, found excuses to hand her an extra cup of cool water, as though it had simply been drawn by mistake. And Daniel, often the quietest among them, spoke to her in gentle murmurs when her strength faltered, offering small threads of comfort, that she was doing well, that she was enduring more than any person should ever have to. These small mercies shimmered faintly in the shadows of the barn, but they were not enough to counter the grinding weight of each day. For Margaret, time became a thick and formless substance, slipping around her without shape or identity. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. The rhythm tightened around her until she no longer bothered wondering how long she had been trapped. By the end of July, the sharp flame of defiance that had once burned inside her had cooled into ash. She obeyed without hesitation, moving automatically when told to rise or lift or push. Her voice grew faint from disuse, and when she cried at night, her sobs were muffled into the thin mattress so no one would hear. In daylight, she wore her silence like another layer of skin. Edmund saw only progress. His ledger grew thick with entries describing her physical decline and emotional collapse. He catalogued her weight loss with meticulous satisfaction. He praised her automatic compliance, noting her lack of outbursts as though it were an accomplishment rather than a sign of suffocating despair. He believed she was becoming what he intended, a creature shaped by obedience alone, stripped of her own thoughts, her own agency, her own future. By the time summer deepened into August, Margaret had spent 7 weeks inside the barn. The changes were stark. Her body had thinned from constant exertion, the softness replaced by lean, tired muscle. But the deeper transformation was internal. The vibrant, spirited woman who had once demanded explanations had faded into someone remote and quiet, as though she were watching her own life from a distance she couldn't close. She had learned that resistance did not change outcomes, that survival meant moving when asked, accepting what was given, and never expecting anything more. Edmund, however, was not content with her quiet obedience. He wanted to erase every remnant of the daughter he remembered, and so a new phase of her treatment began, one shaped not by labor, but by confusion. Some mornings, she would be worked mercilessly until her legs gave out. Other days, she was assigned only light tasks, left wondering what invisible rules she had followed or broken. Meals fluctuated unpredictably as well, some filling enough to ease her hunger, others barely a mouthful. All of it was orchestrated with purpose, to ensure Margaret could never map the terrain of her own life, could never anticipate what came next. Uncertainty was to be her constant companion. Then came the accusations. She was told she had moved too slowly at the mill, even when her arms still quivered from hours of relentless pushing. She was told she had spoken disrespectfully, even on days she had not uttered a single word. Each charge brought consequences: lost meals, extended work, fewer hours of sleep. Soon she realized that nothing she did mattered. The rules had ceased to exist. Punishment or mercy came solely at her father's whim. This new strategy corroded something inside her, something fragile that had survived the first weeks. The belief that she might eventually regain control. Now control dissolved like smoke. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel were forced to carry out Edmund's instructions, and the cruelty of it weighed on them like chains. The earlier routine had been painful but comprehensible: complete the task and receive rest. Now they were required to invent reasons to reprimand her, to speak lies that harmed her and shamed them. Their roles became twisted reflections of Edmund's will, and each falsified accusation felt like being asked to vanquish the last intact pieces of their own integrity. Yet in this darkness, something almost humanizing began to grow between them and Margaret. She had once seen them solely as agents of her father's cruelty, but as she watched their discomfort, the flinch in Benjamin's jaw when he was forced to scold her, the way Samuel lowered his eyes each time he withheld food, the tremor in Daniel's voice when he delivered a punishment he clearly despised, she began to recognize their torment. They were prisoners of a different kind, bound not by bolts and locks, but by threats against the people they loved. And just as Margaret's view of them shifted, their perception of her changed as well. She was no longer simply the master's daughter, no longer a distant figure from a world they had never been allowed to enter. She was a woman suffering beside them, enduring a cruelty none of them would have chosen. Her pain resonated with their own memories of powerlessness, of being controlled by a man who believed his will was law. In that oppressive barn, under the weight of fear and exhaustion, the boundaries that had once separated their lives blurred. In the quiet glances and restrained kindnesses, a strange shared understanding began to take root. Fragile, unspoken, but real. It was the one thing Edmund had not planned for, that suffering when shared sometimes binds people together more tightly than freedom ever could. Chapter 7. The Shift. Seeing each other as human. As the weeks bled slowly into late summer, a strange understanding began to creep into the dim corners of the barn, soft, cautious, and almost unwilling. Pain had carved deep grooves through every person trapped within those wooden walls, and though the shape of that pain differed from one life to another, it formed a bridge none of them had expected. Margaret's suffering was temporary, a nightmare with an end date known only to Edmund. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel, however, lived inside a permanent cage, one built by law, custom, and the unyielding hand of the plantation system. Yet something quietly universal threaded their experiences together. The awareness of being controlled, of being denied choices, of being shaped by another person's will. In this shared darkness, their differences began to blur, and the rigid lines society had drawn grew soft and uncertain. The turning point arrived one heavy afternoon in mid-August. Edmund had completed his ritual, measuring Margaret's weight with clinical detachment, writing his remarks in the leather-bound ledger, noting her fatigue as though it were a mere detail in a recipe, and then he left for the day. The barn door closed with its familiar iron thud, and silence bloomed in the space he left behind. Margaret sank onto the rough wooden floor of her sleeping corner, her body trembling after hours spent at the grain mill. Benjamin, whose task was to keep watch, settled onto a stool a short distance away. For a long while they remained suspended in a kind of exhausted stillness, neither willing to break the quiet. The late-day light filtered through the slats in thin gold threads. Then Benjamin's voice came softly across the space, almost a whisper. "I'm sorry." The words startled her. Apologies had never been part of this grim arrangement. She lifted her head slowly, her expression guarded. "For what?" she asked, though she already sensed the weight behind his voice. "For everything we're forced to do," he said, looking toward the ground. "For the way we watch you work, for the punishments, for not being able to stop any of it. Margaret studied him for a moment. His face was different when he wasn't performing the role Edmund had forced on him, more human, more wounded. She asked, then why follow his orders at all? What spilled from Benjamin then was not defensive or rehearsed, but painfully honest. He told her about his wife, Ruth, and their 3 children. He told her about Edmund's threats, the way refusal meant family members sold to different corners of the Deep South, never to be reunited. His voice trembled under the weight of helplessness. When he finished, Margaret felt something in her chest loosen. "I'm not angry with you," she said quietly. "You're trapped, just as I am." Those words, simple, truthful, shifted something fundamental. They acknowledged the invisible chains binding all of them. They admitted that cruelty, regardless of whom it targeted, left wounds on everyone forced to participate. It also recognized that slavery's reach extended far beyond labor. It rewrote people from the inside, turning survival into moral compromise. After that moment, conversations happened more often. Not long conversations, and rarely spoken above a whisper, but enough to knit their lives together in unexpected ways. Daniel told her about learning to read under a previous owner, about discovering ideas of liberty and human dignity that he had no power to act upon. Literacy opened doors in his mind, but none in the real world, an agony Margaret had never imagined. Samuel, who usually spoke only when necessary, eventually shared the memory he carried like a scar, the day his mother was taken away when he was only 8. He described the way she looked back over her shoulder until she disappeared from view, how he never saw her again, how he had spent years wondering whether she was alive or buried in some unmarked grave. Margaret found herself telling them things she had never said aloud. She spoke of her mother's death and the suffocating expectations placed upon her as a young woman, the constant reminders that her only worth lay in marriage and childbirth. She described being treated like a possession, cleaner, perhaps, more comfortable, but property all the same. She told them how books had offered her glimpses of a different world, a world where both women and enslaved people were recognized as fully human. And she confessed how harshly she had been punished for believing in that possibility. These conversations were dangerous. They took place in stolen moments, when Samuel pretended to check the stable door, when Daniel stepped outside to fetch tools, when Benjamin looked over his shoulder for any sign of Edmund's approach. Any one of them could face brutal consequences if discovered. Yet the conversations continued because they filled a void none of them had known how to acknowledge. They made each person feel less alone. It was Daniel who eventually gave voice to the question none of them had dared to speak aloud. One dusky evening, after Margaret had finished her tasks, he knelt near the grain mill as though inspecting a loose hinge. "What happens when this ends?" he asked quietly. Margaret had been pondering that question for weeks. Edmund spoke often of improvement and future plans. But Margaret knew what those vague phrases meant. Her father desired a daughter moldable enough to hand over in marriage to a man willing to overlook her misbehavior in exchange for her dowry. She would be expected to live quietly, obediently, her spirit dimmed, a silent life, a contained life, a life built on submission. "And you'll accept that?" Daniel asked, though his tone held no judgment, only sorrow. "What else can I do?" she replied. "He's shown me how far he's willing to go. Even if I leave this barn, I'm still a woman in Mississippi with no rights, no money, no way to build a life on my own." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, the barn filled with the soft night sounds of distant insects and the whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls. Then he spoke in a voice steady, but charged with meaning. What if there was another way? He asked. A way out of all of this? Margaret felt her breath stop. Another way? She repeated. Daniel glanced toward the door, making certain Edmund wasn't approaching. Not here, he murmured. Not now. But there are paths people take when they are desperate enough. Some vanish and find new lives. Dangerous, yes, but freedom has always carried risk. And some do make it. A spark flickered inside Margaret's tired mind, faint but unmistakable. It was the first glimmer of hope she had felt in months, a fragile brightness she almost feared to touch. "Tell me," she whispered. Daniel shook his head lightly. "Not yet," he said. "First I need to speak with Benjamin and Samuel." And just like that, a quiet promise began to form in the shadows of the barn. A possibility, a thought that might grow into something more, something like escape, something like freedom, something like a future. Chapter 8. Edmund escalates, the psychological torture. The whisper of hope that had slipped quietly into Margaret's chest began to change the energy in the barn. She still endured the same exhausting routine, still felt the ache in her limbs each night. But her mind, once fogged by fear, now hummed with possibility. Daniel had planted the seed, and even though nothing concrete had been discussed, she felt herself leaning toward a future she had dared not imagine. Daniel, meanwhile, had begun the fragile work of speaking to the others, one by one, in stolen moments when no overseer lingered nearby. He confided his thoughts. It was time, he said, to decide what kind of men they wished to be. They could continue participating in the slow destruction of a young woman's life, or they could attempt something that both terrified and redeemed them. They could help her slip out of Edmund's grasp. Benjamin listened first. His face, always a mask of discipline, tightened at every word. Daniel spoke plainly. If they did nothing, they were not merely victims, they were collaborators. Each time, they carried out Edmund's orders. Each time, they stood guard over Margaret's suffering. They were reinforcing the very cruelty they despised. But if they used their positions to give her a chance at freedom, they could reclaim something Edmund had taken from them long ago, their own moral agency. Benjamin struggled. The risk was so sharp it felt like a blade against his throat. As an enslaved man with a wife, Ruth, and children who relied on him, even the thought of defiance seemed like a betrayal of everything he wanted to protect. Edmund was not a man who forgave rebellion. If they were caught, their families would be ripped apart deliberately and brutally, parceled out to plantations chosen for their reputation for cruelty. It would be vengeance disguised as commerce. And yet, when Benjamin tucked his children in each night, he found himself thinking about what they would learn from him. A father who always yielded, always kept his head down, always chose survival over justice. He wondered whether that was truly safety at all, or simply another form of surrender. Samuel, often the quietest among them, surprised both men with the steadiness of his resolve. He spoke softly, but with a kind of weary finality. His life had been shaped by loss. His mother sold because she dared to seek an education. His father nearly killed for defending her. Every time he had tried to avoid notice, every time he had bowed his head to survive, fate had found new ways to wound him. If obedience had never saved him, why should it save him now? If he was going to risk everything, let it be for something meaningful, something that felt like a choice. It took Benjamin several days to reach his decision, days filled with long internal battles and sleepless nights. But on September 2nd, he found Daniel and Samuel in a quiet corner of the yard and nodded. Not dramatically, not heroically, just a small, deliberate gesture that carried the weight of a life-changing promise. They were united now, bound not by obligation, but by a shared willingness to attempt something impossibly dangerous. From that moment forward, their world became a careful dance of coded glances and subtle gestures. They exchanged fragments of ideas while hauling water, while checking equipment, while passing each other near the mill. No single whisper would have made sense to an outsider, but together they were assembling a fragile blueprint for freedom. Yet planning an escape required understanding what they were truly up against, and Edmund's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. The punishment he called treatment had long ago ceased to have any clear objective. Margaret was thinner, weaker, and more compliant than she had ever been. The stated purpose, breaking her defiance, had already been accomplished months earlier. Still, Edmund continued to tighten his control, watching her with an obsessive scrutiny that felt less like discipline and more like fixation. The man was ruthless, yes, but he was also calculating. There was a reason he insisted on Margaret enduring this endless regimen. The explanation would not be found in his public rules or the orders he barked at the overseers. It would be buried somewhere far more private. Daniel knew exactly where to look. He had spent years working in the main house, repairing staircases, fixing shutters, replacing window frames. He knew where Edmund kept his papers. He knew which drawers were locked, which shelves were protected, and which were not. So when he was assigned to fix a window frame on September 8th, he sensed that this was the moment he had been waiting for. He finished the repair quickly, then listened carefully. Edmund's voice drifted from outside, something about crop counts and quotas, before fading as he walked off toward the fields. The hallway was empty. The opportunity was razor-thin. Daniel slipped quietly into Edmund's study. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and ink. Books lined the walls in neat rows. The desk, polished to a shine, held stacks of letters tied with twine. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the first drawer. Locked. The second, also locked. But the third slid open with a soft clack. Inside lay a jumble of documents, contracts, correspondence, and beneath them a small leather-bound book that looked worn from frequent use. Daniel hesitated only a second before pulling it free. It was not a diary. As he skimmed the pages, a chill rippled through him. At first, the entries looked like routine plantation accounting, dates, names, notes about workers. But the further he read, the more horrifying the picture became. It was a ledger documenting a breeding operation Edmund had orchestrated for more than 10 years. The entries were written in cold, clinical handwriting. Names of enslaved women matched with names of men, selected not for compatibility or consent, but for the traits Edmund wanted to engineer. Strong backs, tall stature, endurance. He had been pairing human beings like livestock, forcing them into repeated pregnancies, tracking the children born from those unions, and selling the strongest of them at staggering prices. Daniel felt nauseous. He knew Edmund was cruel, but this was something far darker, intentional, methodical, and monstrously profitable. But the pages at the end of the ledger made Daniel's breath stop altogether. There, in Edmund's precise script, was a new section, and it was not about enslaved women. It was about Margaret. Her name appeared repeatedly, not as a daughter, not as a patient undergoing some twisted treatment, but as part of a plan Daniel could barely bring himself to understand. A plan that explained why Edmund intended to break her so completely, why he needed her spirit shattered, her will extinguished. The truth was far more horrifying than any of them had guessed. and Daniel knew he needed to warn the others before Edmund discovered what he had found. He closed the ledger, slid it back into the drawer exactly as he had found it, and slipped silently from the room, changed forever by the knowledge he carried. Chapter 9. The Truth of the Breeding Program. Daniel had suspected Edmund was hiding something, but nothing could have prepared him for what he uncovered in that leather-bound book. As he turned the pages, the inked numbers and tidy handwriting told a story more grotesque than any whispered rumor on the plantation. Edmund had documented the gradual decline of his breeding operation, noting with clinical detachment that many of the enslaved women he had relied upon for years could no longer bear children. Their age, their exhaustion, and the brutal toll of repeated pregnancies were reducing the yield, as he coldly phrased it. He had written about the cost of buying new women, how unpredictable the investment was, how it could take years before he knew whether a woman would meet his standards. The words had the chill of a man calculating livestock, not lives. Then as Daniel read deeper, he reached a section that made his breath hitch. Edmund had begun considering a way to bypass the uncertainty altogether, a new source of breeding stock, a source he believed he could fully control, his own daughter. There, in Edmund's immaculate script, was the logic he had stitched together. Margaret came from what he considered good blood, strong ancestors, long lifespans, and healthy lineages on both sides. Her mother's family, he wrote, was particularly resilient. Margaret herself, though once overweight, had always been physically sound. If she were paired with strong enslaved men, Edmund believed the children she produced would fetch extraordinary prices or bolster his workforce for decades. And because Margaret was his child, there would be no negotiation, no rebellion he couldn't crush. She was property in his eyes, no different than the women he had already forced into his scheme. But there was one obstacle standing in his way: Margaret's will. Edmund wrote that she would never accept such a role. She would fight, resist, maybe even attempt to kill him. So he had settled on a different strategy, one that required patience and unwavering cruelty. He would dismantle her identity piece by piece, grind down her sense of self until she no longer had the strength to protest. The barn treatment, the isolation, the forced labor, the deprivation. It had never been about curing her or preparing her for marriage. It was the first stage of reducing her from a person to a compliant vessel. He detailed the phases of this process in short, meticulous notes. Weaken the body, destabilize the mind, remove outside influences, and eventually replace despair with obedience. The final phase, written almost casually, was chilling in its simplicity. Introduce her to her function. Daniel felt the room tilt around him. The diary slipped closed with a soft thud as nausea rose in his chest. Edmund had not merely been cruel or controlling. He had crossed into a realm of monstrosity Daniel had scarcely imagined a human could occupy. Hands trembling, he returned the ledger exactly as he found it. Every step back to the yard felt heavier, as though each stride carried the weight of what he now knew. That evening, once the shadows deepened and the overseers dispersed, Daniel shared the truth with Benjamin and Samuel. The two men listened in grim silence. They knew plantation owners who bred enslaved people as if they were cattle. Every large estate had stories. But turning one's own daughter into a breeding instrument was a cruelty so warped it left them wordless. Margaret had to be told. When Daniel quietly relayed the truth to her later that night, her expression changed, not in a burst of anger, but in a slow draining of color, as though the world itself had been hollowed out around her. She sat perfectly still, listening as he explained every line, every intention, every twisted plan Edmund had laid out. And when he finished, she whispered just 4 words, steady as iron. "We leave tomorrow night." There was no argument, no hesitation. The escape plan they had been piecing together over the past week, still incomplete, still fragile, had become their only path forward. Waiting longer was no longer an option. Margaret understood that if she remained even one more day, Edmund's next stage would begin, and she might not survive it in any recognizable sense of the word. The men dispersed quietly after that. Each one carried a task, a fear, and a fragile hope. Benjamin returned to his cabin and told Ruth everything. His voice shook as he explained the danger, the consequences, the possibility that he might not return. He urged her to flee with their children if word came that the attempt had failed. Ruth wept softly into his chest, holding him as though memorizing the shape of him. But she never once asked him to stop. She knew the kind of man she had married, and she understood that some choices, no matter how perilous, were choices of the soul. Daniel and Samuel prepared supplies, a bit of dried cornmeal here, a scrap of smoked meat there. Nothing noticeable enough to arouse suspicion. They tucked away a small knife, a length of rope, and a few other necessities. They reviewed the route they would take, following narrow deer trails into the woods before angling north toward the river. If they could reach the Mississippi, they could travel under cover of darkness, using the water as both guide and protection. The journey would be long and treacherous, perhaps weeks of moving by night and hiding by day. The risk of capture was immense, but risk was no longer their enemy. Time was. The next day unfolded with an eerie normalcy. Margaret dragged herself through the grind of the mill, her muscles aching, her hands raw. Edmund visited mid-morning, as he always did, measuring her weight, studying her posture, observing her with the quiet intensity of a man inspecting a tool he planned to use soon. She had lost 61 pounds. Edmund made a satisfied note in his ledger, recording that her physical transformation was almost complete. Next, he wrote, he would begin preparing her for her role. He did not need to write what that role was. Daniel had already seen it. Edmund left around noon, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering just out of sight. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel carried out their duties through the afternoon, never allowing their voices or expressions to betray the truth simmering beneath the surface. They supervised Margaret as usual, maintained the same routines, even kept the same distances within the barn. Anyone glancing through a window would see nothing out of place. But each step, each breath, pulled them closer to the edge of the night. As dusk approached, the final pieces slid into place. They would wait until the cabins quieted and the plantation settled into its fragile nighttime rhythm. Then Benjamin would set a small fire on the far side of the estate, small enough not to spread, large enough to command immediate attention. Overseers would rush to investigate, and curious eyes would follow. While that chaos unfolded, Samuel and Daniel would unlock the barn and guide Margaret into the darkness. They would move quickly but quietly, slipping past the faint glow of lanterns and into the sheltering woods. Benjamin would join them as soon as he could escape the distraction he created. It was imperfect. It was dangerous. It was their only chance. And by the time the stars climbed their highest point that night, they would already be on the run. Chapter 10. Planning the Escape. Night settled over the plantation like a heavy quilt, muffling sound and swallowing color, until only the faint glow of lanterns pricked the distance. By 9 o'clock, Benjamin moved with deliberate slowness across the eastern fields, choosing his steps as though the earth itself might betray him. The old storage shed sat where the property faded into the tree line, lonely, roof sagging, filled with forgotten tools and bundles of drying tobacco. It was perfect, far enough from the house that no one would panic, close enough that the commotion would pull every watchful pair of eyes away from the barn. Benjamin breathed once, steadying his trembling hands, then touched flame to tinder. The fire caught like a held breath finally released, curling upward in orange ribbons that danced against the darkness. Within moments, smoke billowed into the night sky. He did not wait to admire his work. He sprinted toward the main house, shouting hoarsely, urgency threaded through his voice. "Fire! The shed's burning! Bring water! Hurry!" His cries rippled across the plantation like stones dropped into still water. Overseers bolted from doorways, buckets clattered, men and boys rushed past him toward the blazing shed. Edmund himself stormed out of the house, barking orders, fury sharpening his tone. All attention snapped to the growing fire. And in that swirling chaos, just as planned, another door quietly opened. Samuel and Daniel unlocked the barn without a single soul noticing, guiding Margaret into the cool night air. Her hands shook, but her steps were sure. Together, the three figures drifted into the darkness, slipping beyond the tree line like shadows returning home. No alarm rose, no voice called after them. For a time, the only sound was the distant roar of the burning shed behind them. They followed the forest path north, moving with a firm urgency. They knew they had little time, maybe 2 hours, perhaps less, should Edmund decide to wander to the barn and discover Margaret's absence. Every minute pressed against them like a weight. They hurried deeper into the woods, branches brushing their shoulders, the smell of pine thick in the air. Half an hour later, Benjamin joined them, slipping silently through the trees. When the fire had finally been contained and the panic eased, he had vanished from the bucket line unnoticed. Together now, all four moved beneath the star-filled sky. They avoided open ground, steering clear of roads where torchlight or patrols might expose them. They kept near the river, but never too close. Everyone knew search parties always checked the water first. Edmund would assume they'd try to cross or follow the river north, and so the fugitives kept to the dense forest, running parallel to it. The night stretched long and heavy. They walked until their legs ached and their breath burned. By sunrise, they had covered perhaps 8 miles. Not nearly as far as they'd hoped, but distance was distance, and hope was a fragile thing they dared not abandon. As dawn broke, they found shelter in a thick grove where tangled branches formed a natural canopy. Hidden among the underbrush, they settled in for the day. Sleeping in daylight was dangerous, but walking under the sun was worse. The forest carried sound strangely during the morning hours. They heard dogs barking in the distance, the faint echo of men calling to each other as they searched. Edmund had wasted no time. He had sent combs of men sweeping through the woods like fingers riffling pages of a book. Yet for that first day, the searchers remained closer to the plantation, confident the fugitives could not have gotten far. The grove shielded them well. No booted feet cracked the branches near them. No snarling hound sniffed the air around their hiding place. When the sky turned violet again, they rose and moved northward. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Long hours of travel under starlight, short bursts of rest in shadowed hollows, the distant chorus of search parties moving in one direction or another. By the end of the third night, they had traveled more than 20 miles. Exhaustion tugged at their limbs, and fear clung to their breath. But freedom still lay ahead, like a promise whispered on the wind. Then came the fourth night, the night their luck faltered. The ridge above the river was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves. They were walking single file, their lantern long extinguished, guided only by starlight and instinct. Suddenly, the distant bark of dogs split the silence. It wasn't the usual fading echo. This time, the sound was nearer. Too near. The dogs had caught a scent. Margaret froze where she stood, her pulse pounding in her ears. The dogs were not just searching the forest, they were following them. The chase erupted instantly. The four of them ran, stumbling over roots, clawing through branches, no longer caring about the trail they left behind. Voices rose behind them, shouts, commands, the cracks of torches being lifted high. And then ahead in the darkness, Margaret spotted a structure, a barn perched at the edge of a small, isolated farmstead. A wisp of smoke drifted from the farmhouse chimney. Someone was awake. It was dangerous, wildly so. But danger was behind them as well, and closing fast. There was no time to think. The barn door loomed like a final chance. Daniel reached it first, shoved it open, and ushered everyone inside. The moment the last foot crossed the threshold, he slammed the door and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. Inside the barn, the air tasted of hay and dust. Their breaths came sharp and ragged as they pressed their backs against the wooden walls. Outside, the dogs arrived in a frenzy. Men gathered quickly, torches flaring in the dark. "We've got them!" someone shouted. "No way out of there!" Through the thin cracks between the boards, Margaret could see the glow of torches, dozens of them, surrounding the structure like a ring of fire. Then came Edmund's voice, slicing through the noise like a blade. "Margaret, listen carefully." His tone carried a fierce, icy certainty. "You step out now, and I will show mercy to the men who helped you. Remain inside, and I will burn this place to the ground with all of you inside it." Samuel was already at the back wall, feeling for any sign of a loose plank or hidden door, but the barn was sealed tight. The structure was old but sturdy. There was no escape route. Benjamin's voice broke softly in the dim light. "I'm so sorry. We tried, truly." Margaret touched his arm gently, steadying him with more calm than she felt. "No, you gave me something I never thought I'd have. A real chance. Whatever happens next, you gave me that." Edmund's voice rose again, louder, colder. "1 minute, that is all you get. After that, the barn burns." The four fugitives stood in the dimness of that barn, surrounded by hay, breath, and terror, the walls trembling with the shouts outside. And yet in the midst of the fear, Margaret felt something steady within her, a stillness, a resolve. The world outside rattled with threats and firelight, but inside her, quiet certainty took root. The minute had begun, and none of them knew how it would end. Chapter 11. The Flight and the Pursuit. The barn was silent except for the pounding of their hearts. Outside, torches hissed in the night air and dogs snarled as they strained against their leashes. Margaret felt the weight of every breath as she stepped toward the door. Daniel reached out in alarm. "Margaret, what are you doing?" His voice trembled, half fear, half disbelief. She didn't turn. "I'm going to speak with him," she murmured, her voice low and calm, like someone walking into a dream. "If there is even a sliver of hope, I have to try." Samuel shook his head. "You know he won't bargain. He never has." "I know," she whispered, "but standing still feels worse than stepping forward." She eased the bar up and cracked open the door just enough to see the world outside. 20 feet away, Edmund stood like a stone pillar, torchlight flickering across his stern features. Behind him, a tight semicircle of armed men waited, ready to send the barn up in flame. "Father," Margaret called softly, stepping half into the moonlight. Her voice carried the quiet ache of someone who had run out of places to hide. "Please, these men aren't guilty of anything. They helped me because I forced them to. They didn't want to take part in this. Let them go." Edmund gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Innocent? Is that the story you want to tell me?" He tilted his head in disdain. "They aided your escape. They destroyed my property. That is more than enough reason for punishment." His eyes hardened. "All of you will come out now. This foolishness is finished." Behind Margaret, 3 men stood motionless. She heard their breaths, tired, uneven, human. She thought of their whispered conversations during long nights, of their tenderness in a world that offered them so little of it, of the trust they had slowly built over months of fear. She understood with sudden clarity that stepping out meant condemning them to chains and death, and condemning herself to something worse. Edmund's barn, his punishments, his breeding plans. Her future would stretch before her like a sentence carved into stone. Obedience meant surrendering her soul. Staying meant losing her humanity entirely. Neither was an option she could bear. Something inside her settled then. Not anger, not despair, but a quiet, fierce certainty. She stepped fully out of the barn as though surrendering. Edmund allowed the faintest smile to curl at his lips, a smile that said he believed victory had come back to him. But before he could speak, Margaret seized the torch from his hand in a single swift motion and spun back toward the barn. "Margaret!" Edmund roared. But she was already running. Men lunged, but she slipped past them like river water slipping over stones. She darted inside the barn and slammed the door. Before any hand could wrench it open, she dropped the torch onto the dry hay. The brittle strands caught fire instantly, flames blooming outward with frantic hunger. Smoke spiraled upward, heat spread in curling waves. Margaret lowered the bar back into place, sealing them in. Outside, chaos erupted. Fists pounded against the door. Edmund shouted hoarse commands, but the heavy wood held fast. Inside, the fire crackled hungrily, climbing up the stacked hay and licking at the beams that held the roof aloft. Benjamin stared at her, stunned. "Margaret, why?" His voice sounded small in the echoing space. She exhaled slowly, letting the truth settle in the air. "Because this way, the choice belongs to us. Not him, not his rules, not his cruelty." Her eyes shone with something steady, almost peaceful. "He wants to break us apart, punish us, use us. I won't let him. I won't let any of us face that alone." Samuel coughed softly as the smoke thickened. He nodded, understanding widening in his eyes. Daniel looked from face to face, then reached for Margaret's hand. She took it. Samuel's hand found Daniel's. Benjamin closed the circle, taking the last 2 hands left. The 4 of them stood together at the heart of the burning barn, hands joined, shoulders touching. The fire glowed around them like dawn breaking early. Smoke softened the edges of the world, turning everything into a hazy dreamscape. Outside, Edmund kept shouting, kept insisting he would tear the doors down. But inside, there was only stillness. "This wasn't the ending I imagined," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "But it's the ending that belongs to us, and I am grateful beyond words that I don't meet it alone." One by one, their breaths grew shallower as the smoke thickened. Their hands remained clasped, their bodies close. Even as the world grew dim, long before the flames reached them, the smoke gentled their final moments, easing them into quiet. When Edmund's men finally broke through the collapsing door, it was far too late. They dragged 4 bodies from the charred remains, the firelight playing strangely across Edmund's face. He stared at his daughter, what little was left of her. and something inside him twisted unpleasantly. Was it grief? Was it anger? Or was it the first sting of a truth he could never admit? He had believed he was righteous. He had believed he was saving her, and she had chosen death rather than return to him. For the rest of his life, Edmund never answered that question. Instead, he told neighbors a convenient lie, that his daughter had fallen victim to a barn blaze caused by enslaved men who had kidnapped her. He ordered an ornate marble headstone for her grave, a symbol of a grief he only pretended to understand. And the ledger, the cold, brutal record of her treatment, was sealed away in a courthouse basement, hidden in dust and silence for more than 100 years. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel were buried without markers, without ceremony, beneath the soil of the same land that had denied them their humanity. Their families were told they died attempting an escape. Within days, Edmund sold Ruth and her children to a plantation deep in Louisiana, the unspoken warning echoing across every home nearby. This is what happens when the system is challenged. But the story did not vanish. Ruth carried the memory of Benjamin's courage like an ember kept alive in cupped hands. She told her children how he had risked everything to help a woman who had no one else, how he had chosen compassion when survival urged silence. Those children carried the story into the next generation, softening and reshaping it as oral stories always do, but keeping its heart alive. Through whispered retellings, through quiet nights around small fires, through grief and pride and remembrance, the story survived, reminding those who heard it that even in the darkest places, people could still choose each other. Even when the world offered them nothing, they chose humanity. And humanity, once chosen, never truly dies. Chapter 12. The Last Stand in the Barn. In the quiet heat of a Mississippi summer in 2003, a team of archaeologists sifted through soil on land that had once been part of Riverbend Plantation. They had expected an ordinary field survey, broken pottery, rusted tools, little fragments of the past that time forgets. Instead, they uncovered the charred footprint of an old barn. What remained of its frame was only ash-softened brick and timbers blackened by fire. Mixed within that ruin were small shapes of metal, belt buckles warped by heat, the shattered edge of a knife, and coils of rusted chain that had survived the blaze long after the wood had surrendered. But there was something else, something that made even the most seasoned researchers pause. Embedded in a beam burned nearly to cinder was a locket, gold fused to the wood, as though the fire had tried to swallow it and failed. Despite the intense heat it had endured, the delicate hinge still opened under careful hands. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, blurred and darkened, but still recognizable as a man and a woman. On the back, most of the inscription had melted into unreadable grooves, but 3 letters remained stubbornly clear: M-A-H. It didn't take long for the researchers to connect the initials to a single name from Plantation records: Margaret Ashworth Halloway. The discovery suggested the locket had not simply fallen during the chaos of the fire. It appeared to have been placed intentionally, perhaps by someone who believed, against all reason, that it might endure as testimony. Once the locket was identified, historians began digging deeper into Margaret's life. But their efforts were met with an unsettling silence. There were no newspaper reports of the fire that had taken her life. No inquiries, no court documents, no formal acknowledgement of tragedy beyond a brief line in Edmund Halloway's will, years later, stating only that his daughter had died in 1846. It was as if the world had agreed not to look too closely. Then in the courthouse basement, a forgotten storage room filled with dust and fading boxes, archivists found a sealed ledger. 73 pages of Edmund's precise handwriting chronicled every detail of his so-called treatment. 5 months of calculated torment he had inflicted on his daughter. As researchers read, a clearer and far darker picture emerged, one that reframed the barn fire not as an accident, but as the final act of a woman pushed past all imaginable limits. The discovery briefly drew public attention, headlines that flickered across news stations in 2003 and 2004. Historians debated the implications, what the ledger revealed about the machinery of cruelty in slaveholding society, about how normalized brutality could become when wielded by someone with unchecked power. Yet despite its significance, the story never found a wide audience. It pressed too heavily on myths people preferred to keep intact. It was easier to look away. Everything changed in 2007 when a man named William Fletcher reached out to the Adams County Historical Society. Fletcher was a descendant of Samuel, one of the 3 enslaved men who had died alongside Margaret. He carried with him family papers, letters, passed down testimonies, notes written by ancestors who had survived those years and refused to let the truth dissolve into silence. For a long time, Fletcher had guarded the documents, unsure whether sharing them would expose his family's pain or honor it. But after learning about the archaeological findings and Edmund's ledger, he felt that the rest of the story needed to be spoken aloud, finally and fully. Among Fletcher's documents was a letter written in 1855 by Ruth, the widow of Benjamin, another of the men who had perished in the barn. In her careful handwriting, Ruth described the conversations Benjamin had with her the night before the escape attempt. He had told her about Margaret's suffering, about Edmund's horrific breeding plans, and about the decision he, Samuel, and Daniel had made. A decision they knew might cost them their lives. Ruth explained how Benjamin understood the risks, yet chose compassion over safety, humanity over fear. The letter also included accounts gathered from enslaved people on Riverbend and surrounding plantations, individuals who had witnessed the fire from a distance, who had seen the flames rising and heard Edmund shouting, who knew that Margaret had set the barn ablaze herself rather than be dragged back into her father's control. Their testimonies painted a picture of courage intertwined with tragedy. Margaret's choice was deliberate, a final act of refusal. The 3 men who stood with her honored that choice, binding their fates to hers not out of despair, but solidarity. When historians compared these oral histories with physical evidence, the truth became even clearer. The door to the barn had been barred from the inside. Burn patterns showed that flames had ignited in several places at once, something no accidental fire would produce. The inferno had been chosen, not stumbled into. The Adams County Historical Society compiled all available evidence, archaeological findings, the ledger, Fletcher's documents, genealogical records, into a comprehensive report released in 2008. It was meticulously researched, quietly devastating, and read by very few. Stories like Margaret's were often tucked into footnotes rather than brought into the open. In 2016, after nearly a decade of debate, a historical marker was installed near the site where the barn once stood. Its text was muted, clinical, the kind of careful neutrality that tries not to offend. It stated only that Margaret Halloway and 3 enslaved men had died in a barn fire during an escape attempt, and that later discoveries suggested she had been subjected to forced labor treatment by her father. It did not mention her resistance or the months of cruelty she endured. or the fact that she chose her end rather than be used as her father intended. Markers, after all, often tell only the part of history that is easiest to bear. Yet the truth remained in the documents, in the soil, in the charred timber that had held her locket all those years. And through the voices of descendants, through letters that survived wars and migrations and generations of silence, the fuller story continued to echo, a quiet insistence that what happened in that barn must not be forgotten. It was a story of suffering, yes, but also of courage, a story of people refusing to let their humanity be taken, a story that persisted because someone long ago decided that the world needed to know. Chapter 13. Aftermath, Echoes, and the Quiet Legacy. In the years that followed, the tragedy at Riverbend Plantation slipped slowly out of public view, half buried beneath polite silence and carefully curated historical memory. When the county eventually placed an official marker near the site, it offered only the gentlest outline of the truth. It noted the fire, the 4 deaths, and the gold locket later recovered from the ashes, but it avoided the darker machinery of cruelty, refusing to name the calculated system that had shaped Margaret Halloway's final months. The inscription felt like an attempt to acknowledge the past without truly confronting it, as though some wounds were still considered too unsettling to expose to the light. Edmund Halloway lived out the remainder of his life at Riverbend, running the plantation with the same cold precision until his death in 1862. He never remarried after losing his wife, Sarah, and no other children came after Margaret. When he passed, the property went to a distant nephew, a man with little interest in tending the land or preserving the house. Within a few decades, Riverbend was broken up and sold. By the 1900s, the grand home had been dismantled, its bricks scattered, and the once sprawling estate transformed into a quiet patchwork of small farms. Today, only fragments of stone remain to hint at what once stood there, along with the family cemetery where Edmund and Sarah are buried. Margaret rests there, too, beneath a weathered headstone that calls her a beloved daughter, a description that now reads more like a bitter contradiction than a truth. Yet despite the physical erasure of Riverbend, its memory lives on, especially among the descendants of the enslaved families who once worked that land. Many still reside in Adams County, carrying with them stories whispered from one generation to the next. They know the truth of what happened inside the barn, the choices Margaret made, and the courage of Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel, who risked everything to stand beside her. For them, this is not an obscure historical footnote. It is a thread woven into their inheritance, part of the story of who they are. The site of the barn sits quietly on private farmland now, indistinguishable from the surrounding fields. The current owners prefer to keep visitors away, and there is little to show anyway. Just rows of soybeans swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing in that peaceful landscape hints at the terror and resistance that once took place there. Still, the story endures, preserved not through monuments, but through scholarship, community memory, and the determination of those who refuse to let such histories disappear. The Riverbend story reminds us that cruelty rarely appears out of nowhere. It is often something structured, justified, rehearsed, a system that teaches people how to break others in predictable, devastating ways. Edmund Halloway's treatment of his daughter was not a sudden act of madness. It followed patterns he had learned from men who understood how to shatter the bodies and minds of the enslaved. The barn was merely an extension of methods already woven into the fabric of the plantation world. It was a place where power operated without limits, where suffering became routine, and where silence protected the perpetrators far more than it ever protected the victims. But even within the machinery of oppression, choices remained. Small, fragile, dangerous choices. Margaret could have surrendered to the life Edmund crafted for her, could have bent beneath the weight of his designs. Instead, she reached toward the three men who shared her captivity, forging a thin but powerful bond across the lines her father had drawn. And when the moment came, she chose the only form of freedom left to her, refusing to let Edmund dictate the terms of her final breath. It was a terrible choice, but it was hers. Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel faced their own impossible decisions. They could have preserved themselves by cooperating, by distancing themselves from Margaret's suffering, but they refused. They chose compassion over self-preservation, solidarity over survival. They chose to help a young woman who had been abandoned by every institution meant to protect her. In the end, they chose to stand with her, literally, within the walls of the burning barn, offering what little defiance they had left. Their actions did not reshape the world. They did not overthrow the system or save themselves or prevent the horrors from continuing. But within a landscape built on dehumanization, they asserted their humanity in the only ways they could. And that, in its own quiet way, matters deeply. It is a reminder that even in places designed to crush the spirit, people continue to reach for dignity, for connection, for something that resembles freedom. The story of Riverbend lingers because it asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about how systems of power function, how violence becomes normalized, how suffering becomes invisible, and how entire communities can be shaped by stories they were never meant to hear. It also asks us to honor the small acts of resistance that rarely make it into textbooks, the choices made by people who had almost no choices at all. Though the barn is gone, though Riverbend exists now only in ruins and records, the echoes of that night still ripple outward. They remind us that history is not simply a collection of dates and events. It is a dialogue between the past and the present, a way of understanding how cruelty persists and how courage survives in spite of it. The choices made inside that wooden structure may belong to a distant century, but the questions they raise are still with us, lingering softly in the dark like an unresolved whisper, asking us to remember, to reckon, and to never look away. My final thoughts. As the last pages of this story settle into silence, we are left with more than a record of cruelty. We are left with a reminder of how deeply the human spirit can resist, even when all power seems concentrated in the hands of one person. Margaret, Benjamin, Samuel, and Daniel were never meant to be remembered. Their voices were meant to be erased by fear, by time, and by the systems that protected men like Edmund. And yet the fragments that survived, ledgers, testimonies, objects buried beneath the floorboards, whispers passed down through families, form a quiet rebellion of their own. They show us that even in the darkest corners of history, compassion can bloom where it is least expected, and courage can rise from people society valued the least. Their story becomes a mirror, asking how far people will go to control others, and how far others will go to reclaim their humanity. In the end, the four who died in that final barn did not vanish. They carved their story into the very bones of time. And that perhaps is the real legacy. Truth finding a way back into the light, no matter how hard someone once tried to bury it. If this quiet retelling helped you reflect, unwind, or simply drift through the forgotten corners of history, you're welcome to stay a little longer. You can gently tap the like button or subscribe, not out of urgency, but so these calm journeys can find their way back to you on the nights you need them most. More stories wait in the shadows of the past, ready to unfold softly at the end of your day. Until then, breathe deeply, rest well, and let the night carry you into peace.